Good morning, Grand Slam Warriors.
Morning, sir.
So today we are going to have our SAPR Stand Down Day Wing Commanders Call. And across our Air Force, every single wing is going to have a SAPR Stand Down Day. And they're all going to begin with a Wing Commanders Call. And then they're going to break off into some small group sessions. This is meant to be a scripted brief. It was built and developed and approved by the Chief of Staff and the SAPR office back in Washington, D.C. And so I'm going to present it as a scripted brief. That is not normally my methodology of presenting things, but I want to make sure that I communicate what the Chief of Staff, the Secretary, the Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force, and all of our senior leadership want each and every airman in our Air Force to receive. I think it's that important. I will offer some of my thoughts at the end because there is an opportunity for me to do that, and I'll be happy to entertain any comments or questions when we get to the end as well. So if you would please bring up the first slide. Our senior-most leadership feels pretty strongly about this, and let me share with you the quotes from Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel. Sexual harassment and sexual assault in the military are a profound betrayal of sacred oaths and sacred trusts, and this scourge must be stamped out. We are all accountable and responsible for ensuring that this happens. We cannot fail America. We cannot fail each other, and we cannot fail the men and women that we lead. General Mark Welsh, our Chief of Staff, says that sexual assault undermines the mission effectiveness of our great force. Nothing saddens me more than to know that this cancer exists in our rank. This slide and the two that follow it come from a 2012 Department of Defense Workforce and Gender Relations Survey of active duty members, the WGRA, and I'll refer to this several times throughout the brief. And this report is meant to encapsulate what has happened throughout all of DoD in regards to sexual assault. This first chart shows the total number of sexual assault incidents, and it comes from the data within the WGRA. 3,259 incidents in fiscal year 12. Next slide. This slide breaks down the incident data a little bit further. Over 790 sexual assaults were reported, and this represents 24% of all the potential sexual assaults that occurred. There may be many barriers to victims reporting, and one of the biggest reasons is the fear of not being believed. We know that in most cases we don't have evidence that people who report a sexual assault are lying. Some recent research in this area suggests that false reports are rare. For example, Lisak, Lonsway, and Archambault in 2009 concluded that as few as 2 to 8% of the reports are false. Next slide, please. As you can see, more and more of the report or the actual assaults grayed out. This actually represents the 449 unrestricted reports and the 449 investigations that took place. The important fact for you to take away from this is that most of our victims don't report. These are our airmen who live and work among us, who may need help but don't come forward. As a leader, I want to encourage anyone who is in need of support to come forward. We will support you. We will treat you with dignity and respect and fairly investigate your case. As airmen, I need you to look at the gray and realize that survivors of sexual assault are around you every day. The things you say and do affect them, either in a positive or a negative way. After you leave here and you get in your small group discussions, you will have an opportunity to examine how each of our behaviors influences those around us. Let me emphasize, offenders are detrimental to our Air Force. Over 3,000 victims affect our mission, affect our family and our fellow airmen. In order to encourage victims to come forward, we need to understand how offenders operate, as this influences our ability to recognize when our biases interfere with a fair assessment of victims' cases. This crime does occur amongst our ranks. Offenders move amongst us. This may be difficult for you to accept, as most of us are doing good things, and we may not believe or want to believe that a fellow airman would harm another member of our Air Force family. Offenders count on us doubting that. The victim's accounts and the offender's intent. When we resist the facts, victims will not report and offenders will continue to operate amongst us. Slide, please. This represents the 2013 data for reports of sexual assault, and there was a 32.5% increase in 1 year. This doesn't necessarily mean that things got worse, though. Although any sexual assault is detrimental to an individual, it can also mean that we are getting more people in the gray from slide 6 to come forward and to report. For example, the Air Force has been the leader in a program that allows victims to have legal representation and to know what their legal rights are by being provided a special victims counsel if they choose to have one. On this slide, we see that 127 cases, or about 12.13% of the reports, were made from sexual assaults occurred before entering our Air Force. Before entering our Air Force. And this is up from last year, or FY12, when those that reported an assault prior to their military service was only 8.25% of all reported cases. Next slide. Though this slide is busy, it is a critical one that shares important information about offenders and the environmental factors that contribute to their illegal behavior. And that's on the left side of the slide. The rainbow color is before an assault, which means that it is prevention. The grayscale is after the assault, which is our response. And the next 5 slides will simplify all the information on this colorful slide. Next slide, please. On this slide are some of the characteristics and indicators of offenders. You need to understand this. Most offenders are heterosexual males. That does not mean that men who have some of these characteristics will offend, or that all men are offenders. But these are some common characteristics found in the research. They include hostility towards the opposite sex, holding gender role stereotypes. Some may have experienced abuse or violence as a child. They may have peers who view forced sex as acceptable. And they also use powerful rationalizations to excuse their behavior as non-criminal. Next slide, please. This slide depicts the behavior progression and grooming methods of offenders and the environment that they like to operate in, as it allows them to hide and to go unchallenged. The non-stranger offender planning sequence contains many environmental cues that allow perpetrators to advance their criminal behaviors. When an environment condones or even encourages inappropriate behaviors like harassment, gender-focused jokes, vulgar pictures or comments, offenders find it conducive to their behaviors. It helps them to hide in plain sight. Each step on the continuum of behaviors allows for an easy slide into the next behavior with little question. If an environment is clear of these inappropriate behaviors, comments, and jokes, the actions of the offender stands out as extreme. In other words, out of the norm. We always have to remember, though, that a victim of sexual assault is never responsible when a crime has been committed against them. Next slide. The center of this slide is about criminal behavior. It occurs when prevention efforts on all levels have failed, from bystander intervention to environments that hold respect and dignity for all as utmost importance. It occurs, however, because a person, the offender, decided to commit this crime. Sexual assaults include acts of rape, sodomy, forced oral sex, and unwanted touching for sexual gratification. The attempt to do any of these acts falls within the definition of sexual assault. The right side of this slide is what happens when the prevention doesn't work, and this is our response. Though first responders and commanders have requirements in responding, so do all airmen. Next slide. This is where we assist the victims. All reports of sexual assault, whether restricted or unrestricted, receive SARC or VA assignment. There's a safety assessment and medical treatment. There's legal support if they so desire, as well as counseling options and continued support. The bottom line here is we will take care of victims regardless of which type of report they make. Next slide. In the response side of this continuum, it's critical that commanders and supervisors and first responders mitigate re-traumatizing victims who make unrestricted reports. It is imperative that when an airman knows about a victim of sexual assault, that he or she also mitigates re-traumatization of the victim by not spreading rumors and by not placing judgment or blame. Airmen can support victims by getting them to the SARC or a victim advocate. They should withhold judgment on either party and allow both the victim and the alleged offender to be treated with dignity throughout the process. Some unrestricted reports will have civilian judicial and disposition procedures based upon the jurisdiction, but SAPR personnel and their leaders are here to support the victims. Next slide. A study by Lesak and Miller found that 120 men freely admitted to acts that met the legal definition of rape. None of them were reported and thus never prosecuted. The serial offenders averaged 6 victims each. The 120 rapists the researchers interviewed were responsible for 1,225 separate acts of interpersonal violence, including rape, battery, and child physical and sexual abuse. A similar study conducted by McWhorter et al. With a military population, which happened to be Navy, found 136 offenders admitted to acts that met the legal definition of rape. None were reported and thus never prosecuted. The serial offenders averaged 8 rapes per rapist. Roughly 12% of the male naval recruits admitted to sexual assault. The bottom line to this is Repeat offenders are not uncommon. 90 to 95% repeat their behavior, and that false reports are rare. Slide. If one of our airmen is sexually assaulted, there is a high probability that the offender will do it again. Holding these offenders accountable for their behaviors affects countless number of potential victims, and that's why it is so important that victims report these crimes. This film is an excerpt from an article written by a rapist. He wrote it anonymously to the Manhattan Spirit, a newspaper in New York. The actor is an airman who volunteered to reenact the confession. Besides the fact that he admits to raping a woman, notice the terms that prove this was an intentional and non-consensual act. This is a real-life example of how offenders think. It is a good example of how they manipulate by insulating their victims, justifying their behaviors, and even placing blame on the victims. Play the movie, please.
I raped a woman. I don't believe that I'm a pathological sex offender, but at the same time, I raped. I met her at the bar. She was from England and had come to New York for a short time to tour with a musical review or something. When I walked in, I knew I wanted this girl. I wanted to have sex that night, and she looked like an inviting prospect. It was clear she'd been drinking before I'd arrived, and we had 3 or 4 drinks together. Our thighs rubbed together, my arm brushed against her breast. I was getting to her. We drank some more, and I grew confident that I was not going home alone that night. She was staying at a friend's place downtown, and I assumed that when we left together, it meant she was going over to my place. Once I had her out of the bar, she had no friends to help her, no one to call, nowhere to go except where I wanted her to go. We started walking, and she asked, "Where are we going?" I said, "Just walking." Knowing that we were headed in the direction of my apartment, we would stop sporadically and make out. During one heavy session, I said to her, "Come back to my place." She refused. I said, "What do you mean, no? This is New York City. You don't leave a bar with a guy and not sleep with him. Come on, this isn't England. This is a big city. This is how we do things." She still refused, but I could tell it was influencing her with that ridiculous line. We got up to my apartment and I began kissing her, but now she was not responding like she did on the street. I asked her, "What's the matter?" She just stared blankly past me. I began to touch her more aggressively, squeezing her breasts, rubbing the inside of her thighs. Still no reaction. I felt like I was fondling a rag doll. Not that I cared, I didn't need any response to get what I wanted. I tried to take her top off, and she locked her arms to her sides. I pulled and forced her arms until I got it off. I eased her down on the bed. She did not resist me, but moved like dead weight, staring straight ahead and grinding her teeth furiously. "Ugh, what a repulsive sound," I said. Not a word was spoken during the struggle. Just me trying to get her legs apart and her trying to get them back together. It was primal. Sex lasted about a minute or 2, and when it was over, I had the familiar aftertaste left by unsatisfying sex. My coercive power, which had been so relentless 5 minutes before, was spent. The manipulative force I had used left me empty. I didn't want this girl sleeping in my bed. I also didn't want to walk her home. She sat up in bed. She wanted to leave. But now it was 4 in the morning, and I couldn't let her go alone, even if she did know how to get back. "Just sleep over," I said reluctantly. "You can leave when it's light out." She did sleep over. Didn't stop grinding her teeth the entire night. When we got up the next morning, I insisted she wait and walk out with me. The last thing I said to her when we hit the streets was, "You have to walk that way to get back to your friend's house." I raped a woman.
If we were to assign a motto to Jack or to many men like him, it would sound something like this: I'm going to have sex tonight. If it's consensual, that's fine, but I'm going to have sex tonight. What we heard Jack describe was a well thought out, well calculated, and manipulative plan for how he was going to accomplish his goal. Whether she consented, which he tells us he knew that she did not, didn't matter to him. You can tell from his story that what she said, what she did, and what she wanted didn't matter. He was going to take sex from her. Consider if we had only heard her side of the story. What if she told us that she met him at a bar, drank with him, walked to his apartment with him, had some consensual sexual contact with him, and even spent the night with him? It's very unlikely that we would be seeing a successful rape charge to come from those facts, even though he tells us that all of those things were true, and he raped her in spite of them. It's important for us to know that this is not about drunk sex, and there's no such thing as accidental rape. Offenders such as this one premeditate their crimes, and they choose their victims intentionally. They also use alcohol to very intentionally help disarm their victims, and they ignore the signals of non-consent. You also heard Jack describe how the victim acted once she realized what Jack was about to do to her. She was non-responsive when he tried to kiss her. He described how she just stared past him and didn't respond as he squeezed her breasts and rubbed the inside of her thigh. She tried to keep him from pulling her blouse off, but he ignored her. During the rape, she ground her teeth together, stared blankly past him, and did not respond or participate. What Jack describes here is a common response to trauma, a frozen fright response. Jack told us how terrifying it must have been for this young woman from a different country to be forced into a sexual act by someone she had just met. Jack said that for all she knew, she could have just as easily been killed by him. You might find yourself saying, if that was me, I would never have done that, or I would have done this. We respond like this in part because none of us wants to believe that this could ever happen to us. So sometimes we judge what the victim did or didn't do. We play Monday morning quarterback. The truth is that no one knows how they will respond to a traumatic situation, such as sexual assault, until they are faced with it in their own life. Beware of this tendency to judge victims for what you think they did wrong. What matters is that we understand who put them in the situation and caused the trauma in the first place, the offender. In this case, it was Jack.
Slide, please. Focus on the offender. That is the theme of this year's Sexual Assault Awareness Month. The motivation behind most sexual assaults is power and control. A person can take control, humiliate, intimidate, or act out power by raising a fist to someone, or they can sexually assault them. Rape isn't committed because someone can't stop themselves during a sexual encounter or it's a mistake. Offenders intentionally perpetrate. No does not matter to them. From the earlier analysis that we saw the charts from, we know that 22% of offenders use some degree of physical force during the actual assault. Another 21% threatened to ruin the victim's reputation if he or she did not consent. And 18% threatened to physically harm the victim if he or she did not consent. This shows the intentionality and the choices made by the offender. In the Gallup survey poll, over half of the victims of sexual assault communicated no in some manner, but it was ignored by the offender. This chart represents us. It's not meant to be scientifically accurate. It's for conceptual purposes only. The percentages put on the slide here are approximate based on multiple studies of sexual assault, coercion, and perpetration. The point to the chart is the group on the far left, outlined in green, represents the overwhelming majority of us that have not and would not ever consider committing sexual assault. And we are the ones who can intervene and prevent them. There is a smaller group, some of whom fall inside the green container and continue on towards the smaller red container, that we need to deter because they allow or even themselves perpetrate some form of sexually coercive behavior. And we want and need to try to reach them and make them recognize the consequences of their actions. These are the people who would tell offensive jokes, who might write sexually suggestive sayings or sexually suggestive pictures on a whiteboard, or leave sexually suggestive magazines laying around in public areas. We need those people to understand the effects of the continuum of violence that we talked about earlier. The far right container in red, those are that very small percentage of folks who carry out that cancerous behavior called sexual assault. We can change this issue of sexual assault. We can create and maintain a culture of dignity and respect. We can all stand up against the others and say something to those who don't maintain an appropriate Air Force culture of dignity and respect. We can all provide support for victims or potential victims and help deter those who do not maintain our standards. The majority of us, with our values and our actions, can create prevention.
The next three slides outline the objectives of the Air Force's SAPR strategy. All three are interrelated. By knowing more about offenders and being able to deter them, victims will experience this and be more likely to come forward. By addressing inappropriate behaviors in an environment, offenders will receive the message that we, the Air Force, will not support hiding criminal and disrespectful behaviors. When victims are comfortable coming forward, we will have more opportunities to stop offenders. When we understand how offenders operate, we stop prejudging the victims and we provide better support so that they may report more often. There are tactics here for each airman, whether you're a line airman just getting the mission done, whether you're a commander or a supervisor, or whether you're a part of our military justice or helping agencies. So what I would ask you to do is focus in on the techniques and strategies for your given group on each of these next three slides. Next slide, please. We have got to create a better environment for our victims to come forward. We need to create the environment that more victims feel comfortable coming forward with an unrestricted case so that we can investigate and find the offender. Next slide, please. Finally, we all have an obligation and a responsibility to building and reinforcing our Air Force climate. Every airman needs to know what it means to behave professionally, both on and off duty, and to actively support a culture and a climate of dignity and respect. And commanders need to know that they will be held accountable if they fail to correct behavior that negatively impacts this climate of dignity and respect. Next slide, please. This slide addresses the relationship between an environment with sexual harassment and one where sexual assaults are committed. It is not a coincidence that the two graphs have very similar shapes. Sadler et al. In 2003 found that in a military environment, women were 6 times more likely to be raped if they worked in a hostile environment, one in which sexual harassment was present, and when leaders and supervisors engaged in sexually demeaning comments and gestures, that there was an increased likelihood of a rape occurring. The WGRA supports this idea as well. And we know that those who were assaulted and experienced harassment both before and after represented 54% of the females and 38% of the males. Before we go to the next slide, I want to warn you. I want to warn you that the images that you're going to see are very graphic. They're very explicit. And they were in our workplaces. Next slide. I want you to look at these pictures. I want you to look at these military personnel. And I want you to tell me which of our core values, integrity, service, or excellence, these represent. Next slide, please. Like slide 23, where smoke makes it harder to see clearly. These pictures, these images, these folks doing these atrocious actions blur our reality, and they allowed offenders to hide and desensitize us. Over time, we have become desensitized to such derogatory behaviors when they are a regular part of our environment that we don't notice things escalating. We're less likely to address issues when they arise, when their existence becomes the norm, because that's where offenders can hide in the shadows. And it's not a matter of it's just a joke or I'm on my own time. Our Air Force core values extend to all that we do as airmen. It's about dignity and respect for all the time. Next slide. So if you would, please bring up all the lights now. I wished I could stand here in front of you and tell you that we didn't have this cancer here at Al Udeid Air Base. I wished I could tell you that in the last 3 weeks, we haven't had 7 allegations of sexual harassment or sexual assault. But I can't tell you that. And I can't talk to you about these open investigations because we're going to follow the process and the procedures just like I talked about in that scripted briefing. But what I can tell you about are some of the cases that I've had to deal with during my 22 months in command here. Folks, we've had a squadron commander relieved of command, given an Article 15 and sent home early because he had inappropriate sexual contact with one member of his squadron. And he didn't foster an environment or a culture of dignity and respect throughout his organization. We've had a young Airman First Class use vile, sexually oriented language directed at another Airman First Class in his duty section over and over again, despite the fact he was asked not to. He was given a letter of reprimand and a UIF and sent home early. And we've had everything in between. It's no one demographic group. It's no one rank or age group. We've had senior NCOs, we've had NCOs, we've had CGOs, and it's been everything from the spectrum of sexual harassment to sexual assault.
every one of you that came to Right Start, which is most of you, have heard me say the reason that we are here, every single one of us, the reason that we are here is to provide decisive combat air power throughout the CENTCOM AOR. And you do it extraordinarily well. Every one of you plays an important part in our ability to put steel on target. And we do it with precision, we do it with stealth, and we do it with lethality. Our enemies cannot run and hide from us. But every once in a while, despite all our best efforts, despite all the precautions and safety measures that we put into place, something goes horribly, horribly wrong. And we have a stray bomb or a stray missile that finds friendly forces. And we all know that that's called fratricide. And it sickens us. And we investigate it. And we do everything that we can possibly do to not let it happen again, because it causes casualties and because it creates a decrease in our combat capability. Folks, these cases of sexual assault and sexual harassment are fratricide. It is airman on airman. It causes casualties. It decreases our combat capability. And that's why we've got to do exactly what Chief Cody said when he stood on this stage last week. Number one, we have to acknowledge that there is a problem. And I've demonstrated and given you examples that we have a problem here at Al Udeid. Number two, we have to own it. We have to own it because it decreases our ability to get the mission done. And so that's what I'm asking from each and every one of you. I'm asking you to help ensure that we have a culture of dignity and respect. And not just here, because very few of you are permanent party here. You'll all go back somewhere else. We need that culture of dignity and respect across our Air Force. We need every single airman, our wingmen, to feel like they are important, to feel like that their contribution matters. And right now, some of our teammates don't feel that way. And we can do something about it. And the really good news is that if we all do a little something, none of us have to do very much. We just have to stop being passive bystanders. And when we see or hear those things that are inappropriate, we step in and we actively intervene. We don't let that very small percentage who would perpetrate these kind of crimes continue to operate. Not in our duty sections, not in our Air Force. And so that's what I'm asking you to do. Let's make sure that we have a culture of dignity and respect here at Al Udeid and back at your home base, so that every single airman feels like they are a valued member of the most powerful and lethal air and space force the world has ever known. That's my message to you. That's our Chief of Staff and our Secretary of the Air Force's message to you. I hope you'll take it to heart, but more importantly, I hope you'll act on it.